Welcome everybody to today's webinar on EPA's historic Clean Power Plan, which was released yesterday. I'm Scott Fraser with EPA's Office of Public Engagement, and I'll quickly go over today's agenda. First, we'll hear from our webinar support team, where Lauren will go over some technical logistics for participating on this webinar. Once we've gone over that housekeeping, I'll turn the call over to our EPA speakers. Our first speaker is Janet McCabe, Acting Assistant Administrator for EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. And Janet will provide a brief overview of the Clean Power Plan announcement. And next we'll hear from Kevin Culligan. He's our Associate Division Director for EPA's Office of Air Quality and Planning Standards, and he'll walk us through the presentation. His slides can be found on our website, epa.gov/cleanpowerplan, and I believe that the link is under the quick links box for this webinar, where it's listed towards the bottom. So finally, at the end of Kevin's presentation, we'll address the questions that you submit, either through the text box feature or by sending us an email at cppwebinar@epa.gov, CPP like Clean Power Plan. So keep in mind you can pose these questions at any time during the presentation. Erica Wilson will moderate our Q&A session. So now I'll ask Lauren to walk us through the technical logistics.
Thanks, Scott. This slide that you're seeing shows the GoToWebinar interface. I'm going to talk through a few features that are going to be useful during today's call. This orange arrow, you're going to be using this to open and close your control panel. Since all participants are on mute, you're going to have to type into your questions to enter for staff. So enter your question in this box here and hit send to submit your questions to us. We'll, as Scott mentioned, be asking those near the end of the webinar. Audio is available by telephone only at that number. And if you experience any technical difficulties, please contact me via email at lauren.peterson@icfi.com. Back to you, Scott.
Thanks. And I believe the spelling of your last name is P-E-D-E-R-S-O-N?
That's correct.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Lauren. Now I'm going to turn it over to our Acting Assistant Administrator, Janet McCabe.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. Yesterday, President Obama and EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy announced the final Clean Power Plan, our historic rule to cut carbon pollution from power plants, the nation's largest source of carbon pollution that fuels climate change. I hope you got a chance to see the President's address. We at EPA are proud and excited to be taking this important step that takes real action on climate change. In addition to the final Clean Power Plan for existing power plants, we have also proposed a federal plan and model rule that demonstrates clear options for how states can implement the Clean Power Plan. The agency has also finalized standards for new, modified, and reconstructed power plants. Today's final Clean Power Plan was shaped by unprecedented outreach, including hundreds of meetings and millions of public comments. What we heard helped shape our final rule, and we think the rule is better because of it. In fact, it's more achievable and more affordable. The final Clean Power Plan mirrors the way electricity already moves around the grid. It sets standards that are fair and consistent across the country, and that are based on what states and utilities are already doing to reduce CO2 from power plants. And it gives states and utilities the time and flexibility they need to adopt strategies that will work for them. These features of the final rule, along with tools like interstate trading and emissions averaging, mean states can achieve the standards in today's rule while maintaining an ample and reliable electricity supply and keeping power affordable. When the plan is fully in place in 2030, carbon pollution from the power sector will be 32% below 2005 levels and dropping. That's about 870 million tons less of carbon pollution in 2030, and even more in future years as the momentum continues. The transition to cleaner sources of energy will better protect Americans from other harmful air pollution too. By 2030, emissions of sulfur dioxide from power plants will have dropped 90% compared to 2005 levels, and emissions of nitrogen oxides from power plants will have dropped 72%. By securing the trend toward a cleaner power sector and getting even more pollution reductions, the Clean Power Plan puts us on the fast track to cut climate and air pollution to historically low levels. When we protect the environment and our health, we all win. In 2030, our nation will see up to $45 billion in net benefits from the Clean Power Plan. which means we will avoid thousands of premature deaths and have thousands fewer asthma cases and hospitalizations by 2030 and beyond. And all this will happen because the final rule is more achievable thanks to a wide range of options that states can use to meet their goals and power plants can use to reduce carbon emissions. I've only hit the very top highlights here, and we'll soon be turning it over to Kevin Culligan of our team to walk you through all three rules using the PowerPoint. I want to thank you again for carving some of the time out of your day to learn more about this rule. And I'd like to note that there will be many more opportunities for us to engage with you. In the near term, we have a great deal of information available on our website, epa.gov/Clean Power Plan. And there'll be more opportunities for us to engage through trainings and calls and other interactions. And with that, I will turn it over to Kevin.
Thank you very much, Janet. So I'm going to start to walk through the PowerPoint. And as Janet has already mentioned, the reason we're here and the reason we're talking about this suite of rules is because climate change is a threat, and it's a threat that we're feeling the impacts of today. It's not just something to think about that could happen in the future. It's something we're already feeling the impacts of today. I'm going to walk through this PowerPoint and talk about a suite of three rules. Two of those rules are final. One of them, the Clean Power Plan, focuses on existing sources. The second, the Carbon Pollution Standards, focuses on new power plants. It also focuses on plants that do significant upgrades, what we would call modifications or reconstructions. And then the third rule is actually a proposal, and that rule also has two components. One component is a federal plan, which is really a backstop to ensure that these emission reductions happen. And the second is a model rule that states, who really are the prime folks putting out these rules and implementing the direct requirements on the existing sources, can follow if they wish to, as they design their own programs. And I'll talk about all these in more detail as we go through the presentation. So Jen already mentioned these, but some of the top line messages to remember are this rule is designed to achieve about a 32% reduction by 2030, but it's also designed to start to achieve reductions earlier than that, potentially as early as 2020 or maybe even earlier, depending upon how sources decide to react. While it gets those reductions as early as 2020, there's a glide path out to 2030, and that is important because we are looking at significant changes to the power sector under this rule. And we think that this is important because it gives companies and states, the time to design plans and to make plans that are consistent with business cycles and with regular planning processes as they look to upgrade, replace, and retire units. They can do that in an orderly way that will ensure that they can do this as cost effectively as possible, and also in a way that ensures that we maintain electric reliability. And then the third really important aspect of this is what we see this doing is as companies are going through that regular process, even more than they already are, because we're already seeing a fair amount of this, there's going to be, we believe, a much stronger emphasis on looking at ways to generate electricity that use clean and renewable sources of energy. So, as I mentioned, climate change is a threat that we're already seeing. As it gets hotter, you've got increased risk of heat stroke, heat-related deaths, and things like that. But you also have traditional pollution problems getting worse. Ground level ozone, or smog, is a problem that is exacerbated by and usually occurs during the hottest times of year. As we have more of those hot times, as they're extended over a greater period of time, we will be experiencing more smog and more asthma and other health-related issues associated with those types of pollution problems. We're also going to see an increase in intensity in extreme weather events. And then finally, we're seeing the spread of insects and other things that carry disease spreading, farther north in the country and over longer periods in the country. Once again, insects that typically you focus on and worry about in the warmest time of year, as that time expands, they'll be more of an issue. So why are we focused on power plants, and why are we talking about power plants? Well, in the United States, power plants are the single largest source of carbon emissions in the country. The second largest source, mobile sources, is actually an area the agency has already focused a lot of effort. So between the efforts that we've already undertaken and are continuing to undertake for mobile sources and this effort, we're really focused on the largest sources of emissions. And it's important to understand that what we're doing here is really building off what is already going on at the state and local levels. I've already mentioned that, a big emphasis and a big way we think states and ultimately power companies are going to comply with this rule are using cleaner technologies. Things like renewable energy, things like demand-side energy efficiency, demand-side energy measures, where you basically get the same services from your electricity, you just use less of it. And you can see on this map that across the U.S., at either the state or local level, really all throughout the country, there are communities and states very actively engaged with both mandatory and voluntary programs to take advantage of these types of ways to reduce carbon pollution. And really what this is going to do is speed up to more use of those clean resources. So this suite of rules, the carbon pollution standards, they're really a part of a larger climate action plan. While I'm going to focus entirely, almost entirely except for this one slide on what we're doing for power plants, it's worth understanding we're also looking at all those other source categories that I mentioned. We've got a lot of actions that have been focused on the transportation sector. We've got voluntary programs and other programs that look at ways to cut pollution and wasted energy. We're looking at other pollutants that lead to climate change, and there are a number of rules already in place for those types of pollutants, and we're doing more there. And then these actions are important as we talk to our international partners and work with them to assure that globally we're all working to obtain emission reductions, because while this is an important step, and there's no way we're going to be able to combat climate change without the United States making these types of reductions, there's also no way we're going to ultimately solve this problem without all of our global partners doing the same. And leading by examples we're doing here is an important way to ensure that that happens. So, you've probably already heard, and I think you will continue to hear over the coming months, detractors of this plan talking about its legal foundation. And I think it's important to understand, when you think about that, some basic facts about what we've done, what courts have already said about greenhouse gases. The Supreme Court has more than once said that EPA not only can, but EPA should be controlling greenhouse gases from power plants, from greenhouse gases in general. The court has also said that we can focus on stationary sources like power plants. So there's a firm legal basis based on those previous findings in what we're doing. You'll also hear that because we're controlling pollution under one provision of the Clean Air Act, we shouldn't be doing it here. We think that is a clear misreading and a misrepresentation of what the Clean Air Act says, and that we clearly have, and Congress clearly intended us to have authority to look at pollutants like greenhouse gases, as I've mentioned, an idea that has been affirmed by the Supreme Court more than once. So, you know, many of you have been involved in this project for a long time. We've been, you know, actively working on this project for over 2 years, and that's involved a significant amount of outreach, meetings, public hearings, comments on this rule. And as I talk through some of the provisions, one of the things I'll be highlighting is some of the things we've heard and how the rule evolved from the proposal to the final to take into consideration many of those very helpful comments. So at this point, I'm on slide 10, and what is helpful here is this gives you, I think, an understanding of where we are in terms of carbon pollution and where we would be going with or without this rule. I'm sorry. Sorry for confusing anyone out there. I'm looking at a different set of numbered slides, so I'm on slide 12. All right, sorry about that. I've confused anybody. So the if you look at this slide, in 2005, we were looking at emissions of about 2,700 million metric tons, and we've had a significant decrease since then. And this is due to any number of changes in the power sector. A big one being a growing abundance of low-cost natural gas, but also lowering cost of renewables and more expansion of renewables. Those are trends that we would expect to continue with or without the Clean Power Plan. We would, however, without the Clean Power Plan, expect that gradually over time, as electricity demand continues to grow, that we would see a slight uptick in emissions. What we're really doing here is ensuring, one, that we don't see that uptick, and two, that we continue that trend. We continue the trend of moving to lower GHG intensity, and in many cases, zero GHG intensity ways to generate electricity and other ways to reduce the use of electricity and reducing greenhouse gases as a consequence. Another important component of the plan, I've mentioned electric reliability. That is a topic we spent a lot of time thinking about. We spent a lot of time working across the federal government with our other partners, the Federal Energy Commission and the Department of Energy, to ensure that this plan would maintain reliable electricity. And one component of that is to ensure that we've got a diverse electricity fleet. And if you look at the projections that we've done to see what the fleet is going to look like in 2030, after we've gotten these reductions, we see quite a diverse fleet. You know, about a quarter of our generation still coming from coal, greater amounts of generation coming from renewables, and large amounts of generation coming from natural gas. The other category is a number of things, but is primarily nuclear energy. So quite a diverse fleet that can respond to hot, cold weather, storms, any of the things that typically people worry about when they think about electric reliability. In terms of benefits, you know, that is, you know, really an important hallmark of anything we do. And traditionally, and this rule continues that, when we look at the power sector, you know, while it is a sector that tends to have the most of most kinds of emissions, another thing about it is it tends to have some of the most cost-effective emission reduction opportunities. So as we get those cost-effective emission reductions, we see significant benefits, and we see these benefits in a couple of areas. One area, we see direct benefits from reducing greenhouse gases that reduce the problems related directly to climate change. But the other benefit we see is as you reduce CO2, at the same time, we're reducing other pollutants that come from fossil fuel-fired power plants. Those other pollutants have significant health risks associated with them. So as you get those co-benefit reductions, you get additional benefits and very significant benefits from the co-benefit reductions of pollutants like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. So with that sort of overview of what we're doing and why we're doing it, I'm going to start to dive in deeper into the Clean Power Plan, the focus on existing sources itself. So under the section of the Act that we use, Section 111, what Section 111 envisions for existing sources is a federal-state partnership. So under this provision, EPA puts out emission guidelines, and that's what we've just finalized yesterday. And then states use these emission guidelines to write their own rules, the rules that directly impact the sources in their states. And one of the very helpful things about this system is EPA's emission guidelines really ensure that there is consistency across the country, that everyone is making reductions. In this case, as I'll get into, in a industry where there's some real opportunities in state cooperation, we can set some guidelines that will help foster that cooperation. But at the same time, because the states ultimately write the rules, it gives them some flexibility to factor in state-specific concerns, look at the mix of plants they have in their states as they design those plans. And given the magnitude of this challenge, given the way we think that people are going to comply, which really is turning over their fleet and moving to cleaner sources, we think this flexibility is important, very important, and it's one we emphasized in terms of timing and other flexibilities that I'll be talking about that states can use as they put together their plans and implement those plans. So the way the Clean Air Act works is, as part of these emission guidelines, we define what is called the best system of emission reductions. So we look at ways to reduce a given pollutant, in this case carbon dioxide, from a given source, in this case power plants, and we consider a number of factors. We consider cost, we consider technical feasibility, and we consider the amount of emission reductions you can get with the different types of options that we could consider. And with all of those, we define an overall best system of emission reductions. That best system of emission reductions is translated into a sort of a numeric target requirement, usually at the unit level, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then states develop the specific rules that require the sources to achieve those standards. So in this case, when we were thinking about the best system of emission reductions, we really realized that I think one of the things, if you've been thinking about climate change and ways to reduce greenhouse gases, you often hear there is no single silver bullet, and that is certainly the case with the power sector. So what we're looking at is a system of emission reductions that focuses on 3 building blocks. So 3 different components of ways to get emission reductions, and we looked separately at 2 different types of power plants. We looked at fossil steam plants, which tends to be your traditional coal-fired boilers, and then we looked at natural gas combined cycle units, which are a more efficient way to burn natural gas to generate electricity. We then translated this the standards for the individual units, but once again, that is the ultimate key, is standards for the individual units, into state goals. And the whole purpose of the state goals is to give states more flexibility in the way that they put their requirements in place, allowing them to use market-based programs or to use other ways to phase in the requirements over time, or to look at different types of units and ask more for some than others depending upon the unique situation in the state. And we think that this combination of focusing on what is achievable at the individual source, but then combining all of those individual source requirements to an overall state goal, ultimately gives the states the greatest flexibility to achieve these emission reductions in the cheapest way, and in a way that most gives them and the companies that need to comply a way to address other concerns like maintaining electric reliability.
we're on slide 16 now, just to check in with everyone.
Right. So what this next slide does is just gives you a good idea of where these power plants exist. So the blue plants are the fossil steam units. Those are typically coal-fired units. They can also use oil and gas, but typically they would be coal-fired. And then the orange or peach units are natural gas combined cycle units. And as I mentioned, a more efficient way to burn natural gas, typically younger units. You can see all across the United States, we've got these units. They do, however, tend to be, not surprisingly, more concentrated in states that have higher populations and thus higher electric demand. So I mentioned the 3 building blocks. And what are those 3 building blocks? Well, the first is looking directly at the units themselves. And here we focused on coal-fired units and looking at what could be done to improve the efficiency of the units themselves. So how can you, burning the same amount of coal, generate more electricity, or how can you generate the same amount of electricity using less coal? And in looking at a bunch of data, both sort of, doing data analysis, looking at the best performing units, looking at how units changed over time, as well as looking at engineering analysis of the types of opportunities to achieve reductions here. We defined a best system of emission reductions that does include a building block component of about a 4% efficiency improvement on average at coal-fired power plants. The second main building block is taking advantage of the fact, and the building blocks 2 and 3 both do this, taking advantage of the fact that the power sector and our power system really is an integrated system. Some people, talk of it as sort of a large machine. You might think of the individual units as sort of machines themselves, but overall they're all connected. They are operated in a coordinated way to assure that we've got the electricity that we need. They run more when we need more electricity, and then they cycle down when we need less, and that's done across the entire system. So there are opportunities to, for instance, run your natural gas combined cycle units more and run your coal-fired units less. And that is a way to get pretty significant reductions without having to spend lots of capital on new equipment, rebuilding things. It's just using the system you've got more efficiently. Now, depending upon how that's done, and the amount of natural gas that is used, there might need to be some upgrades, but that is still largely based on equipment that is already existing, which is one of the reasons we think we can get those types of reductions fairly quickly, and there's some really good cost-effective opportunities to achieve those reductions. The third building block involves, once again, shifting away from your higher emitting units. In this case, we're talking about both the coal-fired units and the natural gas combined cycle units to the cleaner renewable generation. So more wind power, more solar power, other types of renewable generation like geothermal, for instance, but primarily solar and wind. So slide 16, slide 18, gives you a better understanding of that grid. So in the continental United States, the grid is really largely divided into 3 sections: an eastern, a western, and what is referred to as ERCOT, which is generally Texas. So moving on to the next slide. I've mentioned this before, but this really is a key feature of the plan, is that the focus is on what can a emitting unit do, what can a coal-fired unit do, what can a natural gas combined cycle unit do. And ultimately, regardless of where you are in the country, the requirements for a coal unit and a natural gas combined cycle unit are the same, whether you're on the East Coast, the West Coast, the Midwest. The requirements on that unit were requiring the exact same emission rate to be met. And that is consistent really with the way NSPSs have been done for many years. We then, as I mentioned, convert that or allow states to convert that into state-level targets to give them additional flexibility. So, like I said, this concept of unit-level emission rates, it's really not exactly how we focused on it in the proposal. It did underlie the proposal, but I think we are much clearer on that in the final rule, that this is about what an individual unit can do, and people will talk about the differing requirements from state to state. That is not based on any different requirement for an individual unit. It is solely based on the composition of the fleet within a state. So because the coal-fired limit, the fossil steam limit is different than the natural gas combined limit, as you have a different mix of those, the overall state targets will be different. But for any of those individual units, if you devolved it into what we're requiring for the units, it'll be exactly the same regardless of the state you're in. The other big component of what we did is relying on this regional grid and the ability to move power across state lines, so that we took advantage of the fact that there are natural gas-fired power plants that can be accessed and that we can shift generation to across state lines. Renewables can be built in different states, and electricity can be moved from state to state. So those were important components to our BSCR. We are providing a number of tools to help states achieve these reductions. Model rules that I'll talk a little bit more about. A trading-ready option, something many states asked for during this process to make it easier to do interstate trading and to take advantage of these interstate opportunities to both maintain electric reliability and to lower cost. Another important concept is the glide path. I mentioned that the ultimate reductions are not required until 2030. Emission reductions are required to begin in 2022, but states have flexibility as to what glide path they use. As long as they obtain the overall emission reductions required between 2022 and 2030, they can use whatever trajectory they would like. So if in one state, it makes more sense to start obtaining emission reductions early because they've already had a significant reduction investment in renewables, whereas in another state, given the age of coal plants, it makes sense to get more reductions later on because they're looking at retiring some of those plants later in the decade. There's flexibility to consider those types of things as states develop their own plans. And I think, as I've mentioned any number of times, we think that renewables and energy efficiency are going to be key components of what states are going to want to do. So in terms of timeline, we just put out the rule yesterday, August of 2015. States have a year to give us an initial submittal. They could submit a final plan within that time frame, but I think we're generally expecting they're going to provide us an initial submittal. It's going to give us a good idea of what they're doing, the way they're going to go, what type of plan they're going to do. This will be useful both to us, but it will also be useful to neighboring states and to companies that have units in multiple states, so they can understand what their entire fleet might be doing, might be subject to, and so that neighboring states can think about collaborating and looking at ways to do interstate programs, an area we know that there's a great deal of interest in that has a lot of opportunity to lower costs. Then by 2018, September of 2018, states would submit their final plans. And then by January 1st of 2022, that's when those state plans should require emission reductions to begin and have explicit emission reduction requirements on sources. And then, as I mentioned, about 15 years from now, in 2030, is when the ultimate emission reduction targets would need to be met. So there are two basic approaches that states can take. They can take what probably more of a traditional approach, an emission standards plan, where all of the requirements are directly put upon the sources, and that could still involve trading and averaging across sources, but ultimately all the requirements are put upon the sources themselves. The second option is a state measures plan. Under this, a state could use a number of different measures, some directly on the sources, some things like energy efficiency and renewable mandates. That would be a specific portion of the plan. However, because this plan wouldn't put all of the requirements directly on the sources and wouldn't provide ultimate assurance that we were going to get the reductions, this option does come with a requirement that if a state is not obtaining the reductions that they committed to and that are part of their plan and that are ultimately required in a timely way, they would revert to and have a backstop that would put direct emission standards on the sources. So I've talked a lot about this concept of collaboration. We do think there's some real opportunities here. We know there are a lot of states that are talking about it. So one of the things that we tried to do was incorporate this concept of trading ready that would make it easier for states to collaborate. It would not necessarily require a regional compact up front, but states could put together plans that would allow them to trade with other states that put together similar plans. And the other thing that we mentioned throughout the preamble is our willingness to work with states and to build off of some of the systems that we already have in place that implement these types of interstate trading type of programs and use them to support that type of approach for greenhouse gases. And then the final thing is the federal plan that I mentioned has two components, and one of those components is a model plan that states could use that will help with the trading ready and also give states a good running start on plans that would be workable. This next slide, I am not today going to go into great detail, but this is a slide, particularly as we have individual meetings with states and more state meetings, we'll go into a lot more detail that helps lay out the different approaches. And one thing to highlight is it does explain where the model rules are, and that there's a model rule for a mass-based approach, and there's a model rule for a rate-based approach. Another thing to keep in mind is these flexible mechanisms ideally are going to give sources lots of different options to obtain emission reductions. So that includes the things that I talked about as part of BSCR, fuel switching, heat rate improvements, more use of renewables, but it also includes things like more nuclear generation. It includes improving your transmission systems to become more efficient. It even includes carbon capture and storage, a technology we know that there is at least one existing source in Texas implementing today. Another key component of the plan, and one you'll be hearing a lot about over the upcoming months, is a incentive for early investment. I had mentioned that this plan is designed so that we can get emission reductions as early as 2020, even though the explicit emission reduction requirements don't come until 2022. And that really is done through this incentive for early investments that would give states an opportunity to give sources credit for emission reductions that occurred in 2020 and 2021. And there's two components of that. One component would be sort of a federal matching to incentivize those early reductions. That is a component of the plan that we introduce in the Clean Power Plan, but we actually take comment on and we'll be working with stakeholders to further develop over the upcoming months. Moving on to the next slide, and electric reliability. I've already mentioned the fact that we think that one of the good features of this plan is the timing and the flexibilities really do a lot so that states can develop good plans that allow them to address electric reliability concerns. However, realizing how important electric reliability is, we've also have an explicit provision that would allow, if there was ultimately an electric reliability problem, states and sources to work with EPA to ensure that those units can run as states adjust their plans to both address whatever reliability problem occurs and to ultimately achieve the emission reductions that are required under the rules. This next slide, I probably don't have time to fully go through, but is an important one, in that it highlights some of the key changes from the proposal to the final. And I've already talked about a number of them. The move from 2020 to 2022 to address concerns about how quickly sources could get these put these technologies in place, give people time to think about electric reliability, any number of reasons that we think that is a good provision that will actually ultimately get us greater reductions, put us on a smarter path forward at lower cost. The original rule had 4 building blocks, not just 3. The 4th building block was demand-side energy efficiency. We still think that is an incredibly important and cost-effective opportunity. We're still allowing it for compliance, but it is not included as part of the BSCR or how we set the state targets. I've talked about timing of reductions a little bit. We moved them back to 2022. We also looked a lot at the trajectory and worked hard to ensure that no state had too steep a slope requiring emission reductions, that there was a more gradual reduction in requirements from 2022 to 2030. Another focus is this regional use, better incorporation of the regional opportunities in the electricity grid. The submission of final plans, making it clear that all states had up till 2018 a 3-year period to submit final plans. Talked about the 2 types of plan options we have. And I think another really important feature is moving from a requirement that would have required states to have upfront agreements and compacts to do trading to this trading-ready concept that lets states design plans as long as other states design similar plans, they can trade without that kind of an upfront compact. There are a handful of tribes in the United States that have power plants on them, on their tribal lands. Those units, we set targets for them. They are subject to the same uniform targets that I've talked about. There are a couple of paths to how we would get emission reductions from those. Tribes have an opportunity to make plans themselves, but as part of the federal plan process, we did propose that if tribes don't choose to do that, that we would be putting a federal plan in place. That's an area that we will continue to work with the tribal governments on as we move forward. I focused on, and all of our maps and whatnot have focused on the contiguous states. We did, as we looked at the comments we got, realized that there are some unique things about the non-contiguous states and territories, Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Guam, that they have some significant opportunities, many of the same opportunities that you've got in the contiguous states. They do have smaller grids, and a lot of the information that we have for the contiguous states, there is similar information. We have some information, but not exactly parallel. So we want to spend a little more time thinking about what is feasible for those areas before putting in place the final requirements. So that's something that we'll be working with those areas over the coming months. I think I've already talked about the implementation timeline, so I'm going to skip and actually move on to the requirements for new sources. So for new sources, a little bit different than the existing source requirements. The new source requirements are done directly by the federal government. And so we've got 2 sets of requirements, one for the coal-fired units and one for the natural gas units. We got a lot of comments on these 2. And moving on to slide 37, I believe, maybe. 36. Okay, so we've got requirements for new coal-fired power plants, and that requires an emission limit of 1,400 pounds CO2 per megawatt hour. For a conventional coal-fired power plant, this would require PCS. Partial CCS is a technology we do think is technically available, feasible, and cost-effective, and the rule explains why. For a modified coal plant, you'd have to be as efficient as possible, and we've got specific requirements for that. And for a reconstructed power plant, once again, it's efficiency-based, but it takes advantage of the fact that if you go all the way to a reconstruction and really largely rebuild the plant, there's additional opportunities for efficiency improvements. We also have requirements for new natural gas combined cycle units, 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour for those units. After looking through the comments, we elected not to finalize requirements for modified units at this time. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the federal plan. That is a rule that we proposed, so we will be having public hearings on that. Like I said, that is a backstop and is what we would put in place if states ultimately don't do the rules themselves. But just as importantly, it has a series of model rules, 2 model rules, one for a mass-based program, one for a rate-based program that states could follow if they wanted to use those types of programs, and hopefully that would make it easier for them to put together a approvable program more quickly. One key component of that is that we are looking at, to the extent that we needed to, our hope is that most states, if not all states, are going to realize the benefits of doing these plans themselves. Like we said, there's some real opportunities for states to think about their specific situations that are a little bit harder to do when you're putting out a national rule. But to the extent that we did use the federal backstop, we would be looking at, what we're proposing is that we would use the same approach for any state. So it would be either a rate or mass-based approach, and we're taking comment on both those approaches. And I think that's the key. And then the last slide will just give you a place you can get more information.
Okay, thank you so much, Kevin. At this point, we're going to pause for a minute. We've got some questions that have come through while Kevin was giving the presentation, and Janet started us with opening remarks. So I'm going to now turn it over to Erica Wilson to go through the Q&A section. She'll restate the question, and then we have a team of EPA experts here in the room that will address the answers. So, Erica?
Okay, thanks, Scott. We've gotten a lot of questions on the GHG mitigation measures, TSC, and Misha is going to take that question.
Sure. There are a number of supporting documents that help provide a lot of the rationale and the basis for the final rule. We are working diligently to upload those all to our website, the ones that we think are most relevant to various folks, to make them easily accessible. They will all be in the docket. The docket takes a little bit of processing time to upload those files, and that is in process, and it's sort of imminent when all those will go live. We will be posting additional files later today and into tomorrow on our website, so check back for those that want to go into greater detail and really want to roll their sleeves up on all that additional information. That includes some of our analytic files, so it includes that GHG mitigation measures, TST, that someone mentioned. It includes some of our additional modeling files that we use to support the rule and regulatory impact analysis, including in our docket will be some parsed files for the final rule that support them. And someone had a question on that as well. So those will all be made available in the coming days. So just check back. We're doing our best to get those up as quickly as possible.
Okay, thanks, Misha. Next question is, in the proposed rule, EPA had parsed IPM data files.
Yeah, those will be those will be up as well in the docket, and people can go ahead and search for those.
Okay, and our next question, we got a lot of questions on out-of-state renewables and how states can use them to comply.
Okay, this is Chris. So there's basically 2 ways that out-of-state renewables can help states meet the emission guidelines. The first is under a mass-based plan. If you're accessing out-of-state renewables to meet electricity demand in your state, to the extent that avoids emissions from in-state EGUs, that's a strategy for meeting the emission guidelines. And I should underline that that's essentially an approach that's a complementary strategy. You can sort of reap the benefits of that out-of-state RE without explicitly including that use in the state plan. The second approach is under a rate-based plan. Out-of-state RE can be issued emission rate credits, or ERCs, that can be used by affected power plants in state to meet their rate-based emission standards. and that can be accessed under a single state plan, also in the context of a multi-state plan or linked trading ready plans. And the details for that are in Section 8 of the preamble to the final rule, in particular Section 8K, which goes through the details in terms of what counts and how, as well as the basic requirements for rate-based emission trading programs that the state might include in their plan.
Thanks, Chris. The next one, also on renewables, more on a focus on timing. Do utilities get credit for any current renewable energy sources they've invested in, or only new renewable sources after 2020?
Well, certainly. I mean, this is Kate Height. The deployment of renewables to date has been incorporated into the baseline that we use to establish the best system of emission reduction. In addition, on the compliance side, any renewables that are deployed from January 1st, 2013 onward can be used to comply using the megawatt hours they generate in 2022 onward. As Chris mentioned, in a mass-based context, as the state is going to get credit for the investments they've already made, those will be reflected in the generation for the state.
Okay, thanks, Kate. The next question we have is, the final rule indicates that plans must demonstrate that the reliability of the grid has been considered. What does this mean?
Right, and basically, I think our expectation is that states, as they develop plans, are likely to work across the state. So not just the environmental office, but also the energy office, and working with their utilities, likely talking, depending upon what type of grid structure they're in with the RTOs. And we think that largely, the types of dialogues that ought to happen are likely to satisfy this requirement. But that really is what the requirement is to make sure that as states do their planning, they've demonstrated that they've reached out to all of those relevant organizations who are involved in reliability and have thought about it in developing the plan. I will say that one of the key things that I've mentioned a couple times is we think that, if states develop a flexible plan that allows sources the opportunity to, either rate or mass-based trading, both allow the opportunity for sources to operate really as much as they need to meet reliability. They just need to ensure that they're offsetting those emissions with allowances or credits, and that this is, that's the type of program that would be most easy to ensure on an ongoing basis that you've met your reliability needs. There are other types of plans that could work just as well. There are states that have looked at explicit retirement requirements on coal, and as they've done that, they generally have thought about electric reliability and what's going to come in and replace those plants. So it's those types of things that we'd expect the states to do, the kinds of things that, frankly, we'd probably expect the states to do even without the requirement.
Okay, thanks. Next, we've got several questions on the Clean Energy Incentive Program. So Kate's going to answer those and give a little bit of more detail on the CEIP.
Okay, what are the questions?
Let's see, there are several here. Can you explain more about how renewables might work and what is the timing for getting feedback? Is the Clean Energy Incentive Program tied only to low-income areas, or is it broader? Give examples of low-income energy efficiency projects allowed under the program.
Well, as Kevin mentioned, the Clean Energy Incentive Program is a program that we did establish in the emission guidelines, but we do plan to have an ongoing public dialogue about the design of this program in the coming months. This program is designed to reward early investments in certain renewable technologies and in demand-side energy efficiency programs that are implemented in low-income communities. And these projects can be implemented according to a timeline that's a little bit different for state plans and federal plans. For state plans, projects may be implemented from the time a full state plan, a final state plan, is submitted to the EPA. If a state is under a federal plan, these projects may be implemented from September 6, 2018 onward. And they may receive incentives for the reductions or demand-side end-use energy savings that they achieve in 2020 and 2021. The way this program works is really a state and federal partnership, and this is an optional program for states to participate in. And the way it works is a project developer will approach a state with a project that they wish to implement, either wind, solar, or low-income energy efficiency. And that state then has the opportunity to award them, depending on whether they're doing a rate-based or a mass-based plan, additional ERCs, emission rate credits, or additional allowances, depending upon what sort of plan they're using. Now, EPA is going to match these ERCs and allowances that the states are awarding to these projects with a matching pool of allowances or ERCs that the EPA intends to establish, and will be limited to an amount equivalent to 300 million short tons of CO2 emissions. I think that covers a lot of it, Erica. Was there anything else specifically that I need to?
Yeah. So we only have time for one more question, and we had several questions on this topic, and Kevin's going to give us a little bit more information on why building block 4 it does not appear in BSCR, and about energy efficiency and how states can use that.
Right. So I guess the most important thing to understand is that our decision to remove energy efficiency from building block 4 in no way changes the agency's viewpoint that it is a highly cost-effective and a good way to achieve emission reductions from the power sector. Ultimately, the decision is about whether at this point it was appropriate to include it as part of the best system of emission reductions under the way we set the targets for individual sources. And I think given the wide variety of comments we received about that, that raised a number of different and thoughtful concerns and considerations, and really decisions we made based on other information we had about things like, that I think between the final proposal and the final, we concluded that we thought there was actually a significantly greater emission reductions that made sense to include in BSCR from renewables. So when we balanced all of those things and looked at the concerns that had been raised about whether it was appropriate to include energy efficiency as part of BSCR or not, and the ultimate overall reductions we thought we could achieve with a 3-building block approach, we thought that at this point the smartest thing to do was to focus on those 3 building blocks, not make any sort of final determination that building block 4 energy efficiency should be part of BSCR. But I cannot emphasize enough that we think it is a cost-effective and a very smart way to get these emission reductions. We actually presume that many states are, and that we included it in our costing analysis. There are mechanisms both under rate-based and mass-based trading to get emission reductions from EE, energy efficiency. As Chris explained, much like renewables, if you implement energy efficiency under a mass-based program, you need less electricity, you have less power generation, you have less emissions, your mass is lower. So under a mass-based program, you can get credit in that way. Under a rate-based program, you can use emission reduction credits that are calculated based on, and the federal plan itself lays out a lot more detail on procedures for doing this. But you can generate emission reduction credits based on basically the avoided generation from the energy efficiency projects. So there are opportunities under both rate and mass-based programs to use it for compliance.
So thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Erica. That's going to conclude our Q&A portion of today's webinar. I'd like to thank all the experts in the room and for the Acting Assistant Administrator for joining us today. Also want to make sure I thank everybody, all our participants, for joining us on which could have been relatively short notice. And again, we apologize if we're not able to answer your question on today's webinar, but just remember this is the beginning of the conversation around this announcement. We're going to continue to engage with you, our valued stakeholders, as we move forward. As a reminder, you can find today's webinar materials and a host of other helpful resources on our website at epa.gov/clean power plan. So thank you. That concludes today's webinar.